Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent their Friday nights at football games and shopping malls, she was reading military history books and practicing combat drills in her backyard. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had taught her to respect the uniform and everything it represented, but it was her grandmother's stories about World War II that truly captured her imagination. At 19, fresh out of high school, Sarah made a decision that would change her life forever. She walked into Miller's tattoo parlor on Main Street with a folded piece of paper in her trembling hand. The design she showed the tattoo artist was unlike anything he had ever seen. It wasn't a butterfly, a rose, or even a typical military symbol. Instead, it was an intricate pattern of numbers, letters, and geometric shapes that seemed to form a complex code. "You sure about this, honey?" asked Jake Miller, the shop owner, as he studied the unusual design. "This ain't exactly what most girls your age are getting these days." Sarah nodded firmly. "It means something to me, something important." The tattoo took 4 hours to complete, wrapping around her left forearm in precise detail. Each line, each number, each symbol was placed exactly as she had specified. When Jake finished, he stepped back to admire his work, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just any ordinary tattoo. Word spread quickly through the small town. Sarah's decision to get such an unusual tattoo became the talk of every coffee shop, beauty salon, and church gathering. People whispered behind her back, calling her names and questioning her judgment. Her own mother was mortified, refusing to be seen in public with her daughter. The ridicule reached its peak during her first week at the local community college. Students would point and laugh whenever she walked by with short sleeves. They called her freak girl and code crazy. Some even suggested she had mental problems. The campus security guard, an older man named Bill, would shake his head disapprovingly every time he saw her tattoo. "That's what happens when kids try to be different just for attention," he would mutter to anyone who would listen. Sarah's professors weren't much kinder. Dr. Peterson, her history teacher, made snide comments about inappropriate body art and how it reflected poorly on one's character. Even the college counselor suggested she consider covering it up if she wanted to be taken seriously in her future career. The constant mockery began to wear on Sarah's confidence. She started wearing long sleeves even in the scorching Texas heat, trying to hide the ink that had once made her feel proud and connected to something greater than herself. Her grades began to suffer as she became increasingly isolated from her peers. But Sarah carried a secret that none of her tormentors knew. The tattoo wasn't just a random design or a youthful mistake. It was a tribute to her late grandfather, Master Sergeant Robert Martinez, who had served in a highly classified unit during the Korean War. Before his death 2 years earlier, he had shared with Sarah the story of his service and the significance of certain symbols and codes that his unit had used. The design on her arm was actually a memorial to the brave men and women who had served alongside her grandfather in operations, so secret that their families never knew the full truth of what they had sacrificed. Each number represented a fallen soldier. Each symbol told the story of a mission that had saved countless lives but would never appear in any history book. Sarah had researched every detail, spending months in military archives and speaking with elderly veterans who had served with her grandfather. She had even traveled to Washington, D.C. to visit the Korean War Memorial, where she traced the names of soldiers whose stories were encoded in the ink on her arm. As the weeks passed, the ridicule only intensified. Local newspaper columnist Martha Williams wrote a scathing piece about the decline of proper values among today's youth, using Sarah as her primary example. The article was shared widely on social media, bringing shame not just to Sarah but to her entire family. Sarah's mother, Elena, stopped attending her weekly bridge club because she couldn't bear the judgmental looks and whispered comments. Her father, despite his military background, struggled to defend his daughter's choice to their neighbors and friends. The family began to fracture under the pressure of public scrutiny. One particularly difficult day, Sarah was sitting alone in the college cafeteria when a group of students decided to make her their entertainment. They surrounded her table, making loud comments about her tattoo and suggesting she was trying to be part of some cult or gang. "Maybe she thinks she's in the military," laughed one girl. "Like that chicken scratch on her arm means anything." Probably. Just copied it off the internet, added a boy with a smirk. Bet she doesn't even know what it means. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them see her cry. She gathered her books and tried to leave, but the group blocked her path, demanding she explain her stupid tattoo to everyone in the cafeteria. That night, Sarah seriously considered having the tattoo removed or covered up with something more conventional. She stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, wondering if all the pain and humiliation was worth honoring her grandfather's memory. The small Texas town seemed determined to break her spirit, and she was beginning to think they might succeed. Little did Sarah know that her life was about to change dramatically. In just a few days, a chance encounter would not only vindicate her choice, but reveal the true significance of the ink that had made her an outcast in her own community. The morning of October 15th started like any other difficult day for Sarah. She pulled on a long-sleeved shirt despite the warm weather and prepared herself for another day of whispers and stares at college. Her mother barely looked at her during breakfast, still ashamed of the attention their family had been receiving because of the tattoo controversy. At the community college, Sarah was hurrying between classes when she noticed an unusual commotion near the main entrance. A military vehicle had pulled up to the curb, and several people in uniform were stepping out. This wasn't entirely uncommon, as the college occasionally hosted military recruitment events, but something about this visit felt different. The man who emerged from the passenger seat commanded immediate attention. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and a bearing that spoke of decades of military service. His uniform was pristine, adorned with ribbons and medals that indicated a career of exceptional service. Students and faculty members stopped to watch as he and his small entourage made their way toward the administrative building. Sarah tried to avoid the crowd, but as she walked past, she couldn't help but notice the respect and curiosity in everyone's voices as they whispered about the high-ranking officer's unexpected visit. She caught fragments of conversations suggesting he was a colonel who had served in multiple conflicts and was now involved in something related to veteran affairs. Meanwhile, in the college president's office, Colonel James Morrison was explaining the reason for his visit. He had been conducting interviews across the country for a special documentary project about classified operations during the Korean War. His research had led him to this small Texas town because of a particular veteran who had served with distinction in his father's unit. "I'm looking for any surviving family members of Master Sergeant Robert Martinez," Colonel Morrison explained to President Davis. "He served in a highly classified reconnaissance unit during the Korean conflict. We're finally able to acknowledge some of their contributions to national security." President Davis consulted his files and made some phone calls. Within an hour, he had located information about Sarah Martinez, the granddaughter of the veteran in question, who was currently enrolled at their college. "There might be one small issue," President Davis mentioned hesitantly. "The young lady has been the subject of some controversy lately. She has a rather unusual tattoo that has caused quite a stir in our community." Colonel Morrison raised an eyebrow with interest. "What kind of tattoo?" "Well, it's quite elaborate. Numbers and symbols that don't make sense to anyone. Some people think she's just trying to get attention with all that coded nonsense on her arm." The colonel's expression grew serious. "I'd very much like to meet this young lady. Could you arrange for her to come to your office?" Sarah was sitting in her American history class when a student assistant knocked on the door. Professor Peterson looked annoyed at the interruption but allowed the messenger to approach Sarah's desk. "The president wants to see you in his office immediately," the assistant whispered. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She was certain this was about her tattoo again, probably another complaint from someone in the community. As she walked toward the administrative building, she noticed students pointing and whispering more than usual. The military vehicles were still parked outside, adding to her anxiety. When she knocked on President Davis's office door, she was surprised to hear multiple voices inside. She entered to find the president sitting behind his desk with 3 people in military uniforms. The distinguished colonel rose from his chair as she walked in. "Miss Martinez," President Davis began. "This is Colonel Morrison. He's here conducting research about veterans from the Korean War, and he has some questions about your grandfather." Sarah relaxed slightly. At least this wasn't about her tattoo directly. My grandfather passed away 2 years ago, but I'd be happy to help however I can. Colonel Morrison studied her carefully. Your grandfather, Master Sergeant Robert Martinez, served in a very special unit during the Korean conflict. I understand you might have some knowledge about his service? Yes, sir. He shared some stories with me before he died. He was very proud of his service, even though he couldn't talk about most of what he did. The colonel nodded thoughtfully. Miss Martinez, I've been told you have a tattoo that has caused some discussion around here. Would you mind if I took a look at it? Sarah's face flushed red. Even this distinguished military officer had heard about her tattoo and the ridicule it had brought her. She hesitantly rolled up her left sleeve, preparing herself for another round of judgment and criticism. But instead of the disapproval she expected, Colonel Morrison's eyes widened in shock. He leaned forward, studying the intricate design with intense focus. His two companions also moved closer, their expressions growing increasingly serious as they examined the symbols and numbers wrapped around Sarah's forearm. My God, the colonel whispered, his voice barely audible. Where did you get this design? I created it myself, Sarah replied quietly. It's based on information my grandfather shared with me about his unit and the soldiers he served with. Colonel Morrison looked up at her with an expression of complete amazement. Miss Martinez, do you have any idea what this represents? Sarah nodded. It's a memorial to the men who served in my grandfather's reconnaissance unit. Each symbol and number represents someone who made sacrifices that were never officially recognized. The colonel was quiet for a long moment, studying both the tattoo and Sarah's face. President Davis shifted uncomfortably in his chair, confused by the intensity of the military officer's reaction. Miss Martinez, Colonel Morrison said finally, I need you to understand something very important. This tattoo contains classified information that was never supposed to leave military channels. Some of these codes and symbols have been state secrets for over 60 years. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know. My grandfather just told me stories, and I wanted to honor the soldiers he served with. The colonel held up his hand. You're not in trouble, young lady, but I need to know exactly how you came to possess this information and what else your grandfather might have told you. As the truth began to unfold, it became clear that Sarah's grandfather had entrusted her with far more than just family stories. The tattoo that had made her an outcast was actually a testament to one of the most classified operations in American military history. Colonel Morrison requested a private room where he could speak with Sarah without interruption. President Davis arranged for them to use the college's conference room, and the colonel asked his two companions to wait outside while he conducted what he called a preliminary security interview. As they sat across from each other at the polished wooden table, Sarah felt both terrified and curious. The colonel's demeanor had completely changed from formal to almost fatherly, but there was still an intensity in his eyes that suggested the gravity of their conversation. Sarah, the colonel began, using her first name for the first time, before we go any further, I need you to tell me everything your grandfather shared with you about his service. Don't leave out any details, no matter how small they might seem. Sarah took a deep breath and began recounting the stories her grandfather had told her during his final months. She explained how Master Sergeant Martinez had served in what he called the Ghost Unit, a reconnaissance team that operated behind enemy lines during some of the most dangerous phases of the Korean War. He told me about a mission in December 1952, Sarah continued, where his team had to retrieve intelligence from a crashed aircraft deep in North Korean territory. They were gone for 3 weeks, and when they came back, only half the team survived. Colonel Morrison's expression grew, increasingly serious as Sarah spoke. He occasionally asked for clarification about specific details, dates, or names her grandfather had mentioned. He gave me this notebook before he died, Sarah said, pulling a worn leather journal from her backpack. He said it contained the names and stories of men who deserved to be remembered, even if their missions could never be officially acknowledged. The colonel carefully examined the notebook, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the pages. Inside were detailed accounts of covert operations, maps of enemy positions, and most importantly, a comprehensive list of the soldiers who had participated in the classified missions. Sarah, this notebook contains information that could have gotten your grandfather court-martialed if it had been discovered during his active service, Colonel Morrison explained. The fact that he kept these records for over 60 years and that he chose to share them with you suggests he trusted you with something incredibly important. Sarah felt a mixture of pride and fear. He said these men were heroes who would never get the recognition they deserved because their missions were too secret to ever be declassified. The colonel nodded gravely. Your grandfather was absolutely right. Operation Phantom Echo, which is what we called these missions, remained classified until just last year. Even now, most of the details can't be made public because they involve intelligence methods we still use today. As Colonel Morrison continued to study Sarah's tattoo and compare it to the information in the notebook, he began to realize the extraordinary significance of what he was seeing. The design on Sarah's arm wasn't just a tribute to her grandfather's unit. It was actually a coded map that detailed the locations of several successful intelligence operations. The numbers along your wrist, he said, pointing to a series of digits near Sarah's hand. These correspond to grid coordinates where your grandfather's team recovered crucial intelligence about Chinese military movements. This information helped prevent a major offensive that could have cost thousands of American lives. Sarah looked down at her arm with new understanding. I had no idea it was that specific. Grandfather just told me each number represented someone who had made a sacrifice. In a way, he was right, the colonel replied. But the sacrifice was even greater than you knew. These men didn't just risk their lives. They carried secrets that they could never share, even with their own families. Colonel Morrison explained that he had been part of a special military commission, tasked with reviewing classified operations from the Korean War era. Recent changes in international relations had made it possible to finally acknowledge some of these missions and honor the veterans who had participated in them. I've been searching for surviving members of the Ghost Unit for over 2 years, he told Sarah. Most of them took their secrets to the grave just like your grandfather almost did. But somehow he found a way to preserve their story through you. The colonel pulled out his phone and made a call to his superior officers at the Pentagon. Sarah could hear only his side of the conversation, but it was clear that her tattoo and grandfather's notebook had provided information that military historians had been trying to piece together for decades. After ending his call, Colonel Morrison turned back to Sarah with a serious expression. Sarah, I need to ask you something very important. Are you willing to help us complete the historical record of these operations? It would mean working with military historians and possibly testifying before a congressional committee about what your grandfather shared with you. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was being asked to do. Just hours earlier, she had been hiding her tattoo in shame, and now she was being told it contained classified military intelligence. What about my grandfather? She asked. Will he get in trouble for keeping these records? Colonel Morrison smiled for the first time since their conversation began. Your grandfather won't get in trouble, Sarah. In fact, we're recommending him for a posthumous Medal of Honor for his service to the Ghost Unit. And as for you, you're going to be recognized as a guardian of military history. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Sarah thought about all the people in her town who had ridiculed her tattoo. The same ink that had made her an outcast was actually a tribute to some of the most heroic soldiers in American military history. There's something else, Colonel Morrison added. We'd like you to consider working with us to identify other veterans' families who might have similar stories. Your grandfather's notebook mentions several other soldiers whose families might have pieces of this puzzle. Sarah realized that her life was about to change dramatically. The tattoo that had brought her shame and isolation was actually her ticket to becoming part of something much larger than herself. But first, she had to figure out how to face all the people who had mocked her, knowing what she now knew about the true significance of her ink. News of Colonel Morrison's visit and his shocking discovery about Sarah's tattoo spread through the small Texas town faster than wildfire. By the next morning, everyone who had previously mocked and ridiculed Sarah was scrambling to understand what had really happened in that college conference room. President Davis, who had initially been embarrassed by the tattoo controversy, found himself fielding calls from reporters, military officials, and curious community members. The story was too significant to keep quiet, especially after Colonel Morrison requested permission to hold a press conference at the college. Sarah woke up that morning to find news vans parked outside her family's house. Reporters were trying to interview anyone who would talk to them about the girl with the mysterious tattoo that had turned out to contain classified military codes. Her mother, Elena, was in shock. "Mija, I don't understand," she said, still in her bathrobe as she peeked through the curtains at the gathering crowd. "How did you know all this about your grandfather's service?" Sarah showed her mother the notebook for the first time, explaining the late-night conversations she had shared with her grandfather during his final illness. Elena wept as she read the detailed accounts of the dangers her father had faced and the secrets he had carried for decades. At the college, Colonel Morrison was preparing for what he knew would be a career-defining press conference. He had spent the night on the phone with Pentagon officials, historians, and intelligence experts, all trying to understand the full significance of the information Sarah had preserved in her tattoo. The same students who had tormented Sarah just days earlier were now crowding around the college's main building, hoping to catch a glimpse of the girl whose stupid tattoo had turned out to be a piece of classified military history. Many of them felt ashamed of how they had treated her, but were too proud to admit it. Professor Peterson, who had made disparaging comments about Sarah's inappropriate body art, was among the crowd gathering for the press conference. He kept thinking about his harsh words and wondering how he could face his student after being so completely wrong about her character and intentions. When the press conference began, Colonel Morrison stood at a podium with Sarah beside him, her left sleeve rolled up to display the tattoo that had caused so much controversy. The crowd fell silent as the distinguished officer began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here today to correct a serious misunderstanding that has occurred in your community," Colonel Morrison began. "The young woman standing beside me has been subjected to ridicule and judgment for a tattoo that actually represents one of the most significant contributions to military history I have encountered in my 30-year career." He went on to explain, in general terms that didn't compromise national security, how Sarah's grandfather had been part of a classified reconnaissance unit during the Korean War. He described how the symbols and codes in Sarah's tattoo corresponded to real military operations that had saved countless American lives. "Master Sergeant Robert Martinez entrusted his granddaughter with the stories of heroes whose sacrifices have gone unrecognized for over 60 years, the colonel continued. "Rather than being ashamed of this tattoo, your community should be proud that one of your own has preserved such an important piece of American military history." The crowd was stunned into silence. Many people looked visibly uncomfortable as they realized how wrong they had been about Sarah and her motivations for getting the tattoo. Dr. Martha Williams, the newspaper columnist who had written the scathing article about Sarah, was standing in the back of the crowd with tears in her eyes. She was already composing an apology in her mind, knowing she would have to publicly retract everything she had written. After the press conference, Sarah was approached by dozens of people who wanted to apologize for their treatment of her. Some were genuinely remorseful, while others seemed more interested in associating themselves with what had become a national news story. Bill, the campus security guard who had repeatedly criticized Sarah's appearance, approached her with his head down. "Miss Martinez, I owe you a sincere apology. I said some terrible things about you and your tattoo, and I was completely wrong." Sarah accepted his apology graciously, but she could see the genuine shame in his eyes. She realized that this experience had taught her something important about judging people based on appearances or assumptions. The most difficult encounter came when the group of students who had surrounded her in the cafeteria approached her after the press conference. They looked embarrassed and uncertain, clearly struggling with how to apologize for their cruel behavior. "Sarah, we're really sorry," said Jennifer, the girl who had been the ringleader of the group. "We had no idea what your tattoo really meant. We thought you were just trying to get attention." Sarah looked at each of them carefully before responding. "You didn't know what it meant because you never bothered to ask. You just assumed the worst about me because I was different." The sting of her words was evident on their faces, but Sarah wasn't finished. "I spent months hiding my arm because of how you all treated me. I was ashamed of something that honored my grandfather and the soldiers who served with him. One of the boys in the group spoke up. "Is there anything we can do to make it up to you?" Sarah thought for a moment. "You can learn from this. The next time you see someone who's different, try talking to them before you decide to judge them." As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah realized that while many people were apologizing, there was still something hollow about some of their words. They were sorry they had been caught being wrong, but she wondered if they had really learned anything about tolerance and understanding. Colonel Morrison approached her as the reporters were packing up their equipment. "Sarah, I want you to know that what happened here today is just the beginning. Your grandfather's story and yours is going to help us honor a lot of forgotten heroes." But even as Sarah felt vindicated by the colonel's words and the community's apologies, she knew that the real test would be whether people's attitudes truly changed, or if they would simply find new targets for their judgment and ridicule. 3 weeks after Colonel Morrison's press conference, Sarah's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The story of her tattoo had been picked up by national news outlets, and she found herself at the center of a media storm that extended far beyond her small Texas town. The Pentagon had officially confirmed that Sarah's grandfather, Master Sergeant Robert Martinez, would be posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his role in Operation Phantom Echo. More importantly, the previously classified missions of the Ghost Unit were being partially declassified so that the families of other fallen soldiers could finally learn the truth about their loved ones' sacrifices. Sarah had been invited to Washington, D.C. to attend the medal ceremony and to work with military historians in documenting the complete story of her grandfather's unit. As she prepared for the trip, she reflected on how dramatically her relationship with her community had changed. The same people who had once crossed the street to avoid her were now treating her like a local celebrity. Restaurant owners offered her free meals, and store clerks went out of their way to be friendly. While she appreciated that people were no longer hostile, Sarah found their sudden attention somewhat uncomfortable. Dr. Martha Williams had published a heartfelt apology in the local newspaper, admitting her mistake and using Sarah's story as a lesson about the dangers of rushing to judgment. The article was well received, but Sarah noticed that it focused more on the columnist's own growth than on the pain her original piece had caused. More meaningful to Sarah were the letters she began receiving from veterans and military families across the country. Many of them shared similar stories about classified operations and family secrets that had been kept for decades. Some included photographs and documents that helped Colonel Morrison's team piece together more details about covert operations from the Korean War era. One letter particularly touched Sarah's heart. It came from Margaret Chen, an elderly woman in California whose brother had served alongside Sarah's grandfather in the Ghost Unit. Margaret wrote that her family had never known how her brother died, only that he had been killed in action in Korea. Now, thanks to the information in Sarah's grandfather's notebook, she finally understood that her brother had died while saving the lives of several other soldiers during a dangerous intelligence mission. Sarah also received criticism from unexpected sources. Some military officials and veterans groups argued that classified information should remain classified, regardless of the historical value. They worried that Sarah's story might encourage other veterans or their families to reveal sensitive information that could compromise national security. These concerns weighed heavily on Sarah as she worked with Pentagon officials to determine which parts of her grandfather's story could be safely shared with the public. She found herself in the unique position of having to balance her desire to honor forgotten heroes with her responsibility to protect ongoing military operations. The experience taught Sarah valuable lessons about the complexity of military service and the difficult decisions that soldiers and their families must make. She began to understand that her grandfather's decision to share his secrets with her had not been made lightly, and that he had trusted her to use the information wisely. As her departure date for Washington approached, Sarah made a decision that surprised many people in her community. Instead of simply accepting the recognition and moving on with her life, she announced that she wanted to study military history and work to help other veterans' families uncover the stories of their loved ones' service. "My grandfather's story isn't unique," she told a reporter from the local television station. "There are probably thousands of families out there who don't know the full truth about their relatives' military service. I want to help them find those answers. Colonel Morrison was so impressed by Sarah's maturity and dedication that he offered to help her apply for a military academy or for scholarships to study military history at prestigious universities. He also suggested that she consider a career in military intelligence, where her unique perspective and analytical skills could be valuable assets. But perhaps the most significant change in Sarah's life was her evolving relationship with her tattoo. What had once been a source of shame and isolation had become a symbol of pride and responsibility. She no longer tried to hide it, instead wearing short sleeves proudly and using it as a conversation starter to educate people about the sacrifices made by classified military units. However, Sarah also recognized that her newfound fame came with challenges. Some people in her town still treated her with suspicion, wondering if she might be sharing other sensitive information inappropriately. Others seemed to think that her connection to classified military operations made her somehow more important than other students her age. Sarah tried to maintain her humility and focus on her studies, but she found it difficult to return to normal college life when reporters were still occasionally calling for interviews and military officials were asking for her assistance with ongoing research projects. The most difficult part of her new reality was dealing with people who seemed more interested in her story than in her as a person. She received friend requests from strangers on social media and invitations to events from people who had previously ignored her existence. As she packed for her trip to Washington, Sarah looked at her reflection in the mirror and studied the tattoo that had changed her life so dramatically. Each symbol and number now carried even more meaning than before, representing not just her grandfather's story but her own journey, from outcast to guardian of military history. She realized that the real test of her character would be how she handled the responsibility that came with her unique knowledge and position. The recognition was gratifying, but the obligation to honor the memory of forgotten soldiers and help other families find closure was far more important than any personal glory she might receive. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, watching as her grandfather's portrait was officially unveiled alongside other recipients of the Distinguished Service Cross. The ceremony was attended by high-ranking military officials, surviving members of the Ghost Unit, and families of soldiers whose stories had finally been told thanks to her grandfather's careful record-keeping. The journey to this moment had been transformative for Sarah, in ways that extended far beyond the recognition of her tattoo's significance. She had spent weeks in Washington working with military historians, helping them piece together the complete story of Operation Phantom Echo and identifying other classified operations that could be safely declassified. During her time at the Pentagon, Sarah had met with families from across the country who had similar stories about relatives whose military service had remained mysterious for decades. She helped them navigate the complex process of requesting information about classified operations and connected them with historians who could help verify family stories and military records. One of the most rewarding moments came when she was able to help the Chen family learn the truth about Margaret's brother. Using information from her grandfather's notebook, military historians were able to confirm that Sergeant David Chen had indeed died heroically while protecting his fellow soldiers during a covert rescue mission. Margaret, now in her 80s, wept with gratitude as she finally received the closure she had sought for over 60 years. But Sarah's work in Washington also opened her eyes to the broader challenges facing veterans and their families. She learned about the thousands of soldiers who had participated in classified operations and died without their families ever understanding the true nature of their service. She also discovered how many important military operations had been forgotten or misunderstood because the participants were required to maintain secrecy. These experiences convinced Sarah that her calling was to bridge the gap between military secrecy and historical preservation. She applied to and was accepted at Georgetown University's prestigious program in security studies, with a focus on military history and intelligence operations. Her tuition was covered by a scholarship established specifically for students studying the history of classified military operations. Back in her hometown in Texas, Sarah's story had become part of the community's identity. The local library created a special exhibit about Master Sergeant Martinez and the Ghost Unit, and the college established an annual scholarship in his name for students studying military history. However, the most meaningful change was in how the community approached differences and diversity. Sarah's experience had served as a wake-up call about the dangers of rushing to judgment based on appearances or assumptions. The high school had implemented new anti-bullying programs that specifically addressed the importance of understanding before judging. Dr. Peterson, Sarah's former history professor, had become one of her strongest advocates. He frequently used her story in his classes to teach students about the importance of primary source research and the dangers of making assumptions about people or situations without proper investigation. Sarah Martinez taught us all a valuable lesson, he would tell his new classes each semester. She showed us that sometimes the things that make people different or unusual are actually the most important things about them. The students who had once tormented Sarah had also been changed by the experience. Jennifer, the girl who had led the cafeteria harassment, had written Sarah a long letter explaining how the incident had caused her to examine her own behavior and attitudes toward people who were different from her. "You probably don't remember me," Jennifer wrote, "but I was one of the students who made fun of your tattoo. I've thought about that day every single day since the truth came out. I want you to know that I've changed the way I treat people, and I'm working to make sure other students don't make the same mistakes I did." Sarah had responded to Jennifer's letter with forgiveness and encouragement, understanding that everyone makes mistakes and that the capacity for growth and change is one of humanity's most admirable qualities. As Sarah prepared to begin her studies at Georgetown, she reflected on the incredible journey that had started with a decision to honor her grandfather's memory through a tattoo. What had begun as a personal tribute had evolved into a mission to preserve important military history and help other families find closure about their loved one's service. The tattoo on her arm had not changed, but its meaning had expanded far beyond what she had originally intended. Each symbol now represented not just her grandfather's unit, but all the forgotten soldiers whose stories deserved to be told and remembered. Colonel Morrison had become a mentor and friend, continuing to work with Sarah on research projects and helping her understand the complexities of military intelligence and historical preservation. He often told her that she had a unique gift for understanding the human side of military history and connecting with families who had questions about their relatives' service. "Your grandfather would be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished," Colonel Morrison told Sarah during their final meeting before she left for Georgetown. "He preserved those stories because he believed they mattered, but I don't think he could have imagined how far you would take his legacy." Sarah's mother, Elena, had also been transformed by the experience. She now spoke proudly about her father's military service and her daughter's dedication to preserving military history. The shame and embarrassment she had felt about the tattoo had been replaced by deep respect for both her father's sacrifice and her daughter's courage. "I was so worried about what people would think," Elena admitted to Sarah as they packed for the move to Washington. "I forgot that sometimes the most important things are the ones that other people don't understand right away." The night before leaving Texas, Sarah visited her grandfather's grave for the first time since learning the full truth about his service. She placed a small American flag beside his headstone and traced the letters of his name with her finger. "I hope I'm doing right by you, abuelo," she whispered. "I promise I'll keep telling these stories and make sure no one forgets what you and your friends did for our country." As she looked down at her tattoo in the fading light, Sarah realized that her journey was just beginning. She had already received inquiries from veterans' families in Korea, Vietnam, and even more recent conflicts, all seeking help in understanding classified aspects of their relatives' military service. The foundation she had helped establish, called the Hidden Heroes Project, was already working with military historians and government officials to identify other opportunities to declassify historical operations and provide closure to military families. Sarah would serve as the foundation's first student researcher while pursuing her degree. Her story had also inspired changes in military policy regarding the preservation of historical records from classified operations. New procedures were being developed to ensure that important historical information could be preserved and eventually shared with families and historians, while still maintaining necessary security protocols. As Sarah drove away from her hometown the next morning, she looked in her rearview mirror at the place where she had been ridiculed and ostracized for honoring her grandfather's memory. The same community that had once rejected her was now celebrating her accomplishments and using her story to teach tolerance and understanding. But perhaps the most important lesson Sarah had learned was that standing up for what you believe in, even when others don't understand, can sometimes lead to outcomes far greater than you ever imagined. Her decision to get a tattoo that honored forgotten soldiers had not only vindicated her grandfather's service, but had also opened doors for countless other families to learn the truth about their loved ones' sacrifices. The symbols and numbers wrapped around her arm would always remind her that every person has a story worth knowing, and that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that have been hidden or forgotten. As she began this new chapter of her life, Sarah carried with her the responsibility of being a voice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. The girl who had once been mocked for her meaningless tattoo was now embarking on a career dedicated to ensuring that no military hero would ever be truly forgotten, and that their families would always have someone fighting to help them understand the full truth about their relatives' service to their country. Her grandfather's legacy lived on, not just in the ink on her skin, but in the mission she had embraced, to honor all those who had served in silence and secrecy, carrying the weight of classified operations and unsung heroism throughout their lives.